Hello and welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. Today's podcast number 1640. The topic is training and the title is, Does Sitting in a Deep Squat Help with Flexibility? So I had a client recently ask this, and I've seen videos of it, and they mention videos. People will sit in a deep squat and say, read a book or text a friend or write your emails, in a deep squat position. And the client was asking if sitting in a deep squat position for extended time would help with their overall hip flexibility. And the answer is yes, but it's incomplete. So it is not something that I recommend, and I think there's better ways to spend your time. And I'll kind of make that argument in today's podcast. So getting into extended ranges of motion, it does help to kind of loosen the tissue in those end ranges. So if you're not used to getting into a deep squat, and in order to get to a deep squat, let's say your adductors have to fully stretch. Well, if they're tight, it'll cause your knees to kind of pull inward in the deep squat, or it'll cause your butt to tuck underneath, so your lower back will be really rounded, or you might just have pain, on the inside of your knee or in your knee joint. So a single muscle like the adductors can cause a lot of issues if they don't fully extend the full range of motion. Now, there's a lot of other muscles that can cause problems as well when we talk about hip mobility. But the idea of the deep squat is I want to sit into the tension that the muscles create when they're stretched. And then as I sit and my body weight pushes and pulls against that tension, it helps to kind of extend the range of motion of the muscles. It helps to kind of loosen up the tight parts of the muscle tissues. So a deep squat can help, but it's kind of good for us to ask, why are those tissues tight in the first place? Now, part of it can be lack of use. We just don't typically get into a deep squat. So you might think, okay, well, I want to squat parallel with a barbell, but I might only do that, for 50 total repetitions once a week. It's not really a lot of time under tension, right? It's not a lot of time. So part of the advice is to address lack of use of those extended ranges of motion. So sitting in the extended range of motion does increase your time under tension, the stretch tension in those tissues. So it does offer some help. But the tissues are also tight because they're weak. The body tightens those tissues either because you just did a workout and now the tissues are damaged, so the body wants to kind of protect those tissues, so it's not going to allow them to stretch to full range because that can cause actually muscle tissue damage and could get hurt. And or the muscles are just kind of chronically weak. I think of older men, they often have no butt. So when they try to bend at their hips, they just round through their back, and their hamstrings and whatever glutes they have are rock solid, and they have trouble reaching the ground. They have trouble bending over. And it's because the glute muscles are so damn weak that they will not actually allow, the body won't allow those tissues to stretch and accept weight load because there's no strength to manage the weight load. So the tissues can be tight either from being damaged, in workouts and they need to repair yet, or they could be tight from being weak. So the body tightens the tissues to reduce stretch load tension across those fibers. The load, if it's body weight or you're trying to lift something, that weight load is then spread across nearby tissues. So rather than the tissues that we wanted to take the weight load, they're only taking part of it, and then the remaining percentage is spread across the muscles that are nearby or the connective tissues that are nearby. And that can then, those tissues or those other muscles can become overworked. They can then be under-recovered, depending on food, sleep, and, frequency of the stimulation. And they can start to experience pain. So you can start to have pain in the joints that are near the muscles that are weak, that are not fully extending. So although long stretching can open tight tissues, and it does, in a sense, load the tissue while you're sitting in that position. But tissues need repetitive loads to increase their strength and size and that will then help to reduce chronic tightness. So 10 minutes in a deep squat position. It would actually be better to spend 10 minutes squatting in and out of that position. Think of it as any other exercise. When we try to grow and strengthen tissues, we do repetitions of effort. Isometric holds, where you get into like a contraction position and then stay there. So you don't move, you just load the tissue and stay there. Isometric holds are helpful for strength, but they're not the optimal way to strengthen tissues. We move. We do repetitions. We contract, extend, contract, extend, contract, extend if we want to grow and strengthen tissues. So you have to load the tissue and move it through range of motion for multiple repetitions over time. So that's why instead of spending 10 minutes in a deep squat position, it would be better to spend 10 minutes just squatting in and out of that position. And then part of the challenge is, in order to properly progress those muscles without pain, we have to load the muscles, load the tissues, and increase the stress load over time, but we have to meet the tissues where they are. So we have to find a stimulus that is within the capacity of those muscles, and then slowly increase that stimulus. So when I do a bicep curl, I don't think to myself, okay, well, I can curl 40 for 10. Let me grab the 50s. We would say, okay, I can curl 40s for 10. Let me, maybe I'm going to warm up and do the 20s for 10 first, then the 30s for 10. Then let me try the 40s for 10 and see how it feels today. I want to meet the tissue where it is. Too often, though, when we talk about weak tissues that are tight and they don't have great flexibility because of their weakness, too often we underestimate how weak those tissues are. So we tend to start with things that are too aggressive, like movements, exercise, the stimulus, whatever it might be. We start with stress that is too aggressive, or we try to progress it too aggressively. And that causes over stress beyond what we can recover. So it causes under recovery for the stress load that we're adding. And then that causes the tissues to tighten up even more between sessions, and it can lead to the pain that we would experience in nearby tissues. That causes us to start and stop because, we try for a little bit, it helps a little bit, but then it hurts a little bit. Or it kind of stops us and it causes these endless cycles of exercise progressions and regressions. So somebody's trying, touchdown squats for their knees this month, but then all of a sudden their knees hurt next month, so they're doing TKEs, but then the TKEs feel too easy, so then they move on to doing blah, 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 and it's just this crazy cycle where they're progressing through exercise choices. So when we think about how can we work on flexibility, how can we work on increasing the usable range of motion of muscles? Typically, what's going to be best is what would be considered, in a very broad terminology, is dynamic stretching, where you kind of move in and out of extended ranges of motion. Now, the clients I work with, they're familiar with these because we do them all the freaking time. But what you're looking for is typically it's going to be body weight and somehow reduced body weight, because that's typically where the best place to start is strength-wise, is something where you load the tissue into a stretch position, then you come out of the stretch position. Into the stretch position, then you come out of the stretch position. So there's movement. It's dynamic, not static, it's dynamic. And stretching means you're kind of going into full extended range of motion, then coming back out. So dynamic stretching is moving stretching. That's the idea of it. So you move in and out of extended ranges of motion. Now, we build these into our workouts because it's just absolutely the best way to do this. And I've talked about this in a million podcasts, but a really good podcast to listen to would be podcast 1112. It's a training podcast titled The Best Warm-Up Routine, and I explain why dynamic stretches are the best, and it goes into super detail, so you can listen to that. Now, that's the idea, is you want to use dynamic stretching. You want to move in and out of extended ranges of motion with minimal weight load, minimal tension, and you want to make very small progressions, maybe adding just one repetition a week to each set, or maybe adding just 5 seconds or maybe 10 seconds of loaded tension. It's small. So you do this 2, 3, 4 times a week, maybe 2 to 3, working sets per time, per kind of muscle group. In our warm-ups, we focus on the thoracic and shoulder mobility. We focus on core strength, and we focus on hip mobility. So those 3 areas. Now, we do that 2, 3, 4 times a week, maybe 2 to 3 working sets per group, and it's just slow and steady wins the race. So you meet the tissues where they are, and then you progress very slowly. That's going to help a lot because that's kind of the mistakes that most people make is they start too aggressive in exercise choice and or they try to progress too aggressively. So my answer would be is instead of spending 10 minutes in a squat position, spend 10 minutes doing dynamic stretches. That's going to be a much better use of time because not only are you going to get increased range of motion ability, flexibility, but you're going to get increased strength within that range of motion, which is mobility. So flexibility is, can I get into a range of motion? Mobility is, can I use that range of motion? We don't want just flexibility. We want to be able to use the ranges of motion, be strong in those ranges of motion to prevent injuries, to address like chronic annoyances that we might be experiencing. So it's long-term infinitely better to think of not only getting into a range of motion, but strengthening that range of motion. And that's what dynamic stretching will help you do. Okay. So hopefully that was helpful. And again, listen to podcast 1112 to learn more about dynamic stretching and how to build that into your workouts. Awesome. Well, if you have any questions, reach out. My email is brutalironjim@gmail.com. I'm always here. I'm always happy to help. If you like our podcast, please share it. The more people we share it with, the more people can help. Let people know that we answer questions for free. Maybe even tell them how the podcast has helped you. People are often motivated by hearing stories of others, being helped. So help us, help them, that kind of thing. So the more you share it, the better it is for everybody. And then thank you to those who donate to support the podcast. There is a high hosting cost every year. I give time to the podcast every single day. So I appreciate the donations as they help cover some of the chaos of this financially and time-wise. So I really do appreciate it. Thank you very much. If you want to donate, you can do that on our website, www.brutalironjim.com. Even just $5 a month, $10 a month, whatever you can give, it matters a lot. It is significant. I appreciate it. Thank you. If you like the information we share in our podcast, you can find more from us on our social media channels. You can find us and follow us under the name Brutal Iron Gym on Instagram and YouTube. So thank you if you do that. As always, I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening.